Hi friends, welcome back to the Bible Project Daily podcast. We're starting off in a new section today, a new chapter 30 of Genesis, and it's looking at the story of Racheal and Leah. Now, sibling rivalries, stories of brothers and sisters, we've heard all about them. And there are many stories of brothers and sisters. Well, there's many stories of brothers, particularly in the Bible. In the book of Genesis, we've already had Cain and Abel, and then of course there's Esau and Jacob, which we just went through recently. But this one is a sibling rivalry between two sisters, in a sense, Leah and Racheal. So, while there's a lot to learn from this passage we're going to look at today, I do believe it gives us an insight into not just the story itself, but also gives us some clues to the history of Israel, and it also can maybe give us some clues to how we react as human beings. But that's the story we're going to be launching off on today. But this is the Bible Project Daily podcast. The project is to work through the whole Bible together, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. Now, if you're joining for the first time, quick reminder that there's a transcript available of each and every one of my talks available on any audio version of the podcast. No matter where you happen to be receiving it in, no matter what platform, you'll find some episode notes, and within that there'll be a transcript of what I've said and also some links to some other ways in which you can access my teaching. But anyway, that's it for today. As I say, thank you for joining me. I hope you're really benefiting from being on this journey together through the amazing Word of God, that the benefit of having the rhythm of the Bible in your life is already starting to help you as you work through this journey of life. And to remind you that we're not that far in yet. I know we're 200 odd episodes, but if you want to, you could still go right back to the start and play catch up for a few months by listening to more than one a day and get through, and then you've done the whole thing. But that's it for now. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pause for a second and jump back in, and we'll continue with the main study today itself. See you at the end. So we're starting off, as I said, launching out on a new chapter, which is going to close off Genesis chapter 29 for us and work our way through to chapter 30, verse 24. And it's probably, I think, going to be 2 episodes for this one. And I've called this little section that we're going to be looking at over the next couple of days A Tale of Two Women. And it's sort of about a sibling rivalry. And as I've pointed out in the past, there are many stories, both in popular culture and within the Bible, of stories of sibling rivalry or problems between brothers. I mean, you can think about famous books and literature like Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. So we've already had in the book of Genesis the 2 stories of the brothers Cain and Abel, and then of course Jacob and Esau, and there are going to be plenty more to come. But this is a tale of 2 siblings who aren't brothers. On this occasion, they're sisters, 2 women called Leah and Racheal. Now, this is a very interesting story. For one thing, there's more detail given about this story than, for example, the probably more famous story of Cain and Abel. So what is it we should know and draw out of this tale of these 2 sisters, these 2 women? Well, I believe there's a lot we can learn from this story. As a matter of fact, this passage not only will give us an insight into the Lord, it will also give us some insights into the history of Israel, and it will also, if we're prepared to look in the mirror, in a sense, tell us something about ourselves as human beings. So let's begin by picking up the biblical text exactly where we left it off last time, at the end of Genesis chapter 29, reading from verse 30. And it says this: Jacob made love to Racheal also, and his love for Racheal was greater than his love for Leah. And he worked for Laban another 7 years. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Racheal remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and she named him Reuben, For she said, it is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now. Now, in order to appreciate what's going on in these verses, you need to recall what happened in the first part of Genesis chapter 9, the things we covered the last few days. You remember Jacob had fallen in love pretty intensely and immediately after meeting Racheal, and he made a deal with his father that if he worked for his father Laban for 7 years, he could then marry her. So he did that. He worked those 7 years, and at the end of that time, the father, Racheal's father, pulled a bit of a switch on him on his wedding night of all things, and he substitutes Leah for Racheal in the marriage tent. And Jacob, instead of consummating the marriage with Racheal, he realizes in the next morning that he has consummated his relationship with Leah, the older sister. Now, as you can imagine, he's not happy about this, not happy at all. Now, there was a custom that the older daughter should be married first among Laban's people. We were told that, but he still tricked Jacob into sleeping with the wrong daughter. Now, if you're asking how did Jacob feel about that, well, we looked and we considered all these different theories as how they might how that trick might have happened. We did that in the last episode, but anyway, the end result is Jacob has ended up married to Leah, but it tells us he loved Racheal. So he is seen now to strike another deal with the father that if he works for another 7 years, he would get the second daughter Racheal as his wife also. They agree to that, and this is how he ends up with Racheal as his wife as well. So what we saw happen in these verses, these which I've just read for you now, is that we see Jacob consummating his union with Racheal. But it also says in verse 30 that he loved Racheal more than Leah. Now notice take note of this because this is important. The fact that he says he loved Racheal more than Leah, now the question I'm asking is, does that mean he doesn't love Leah at all? And I would say, no, it doesn't mean that. It just means he loved Racheal more than Leah. He loved both of them and was cared for and was responsible for both of them. But clearly his initial desire was to be with Racheal. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised when it says he loved her more. He had loved Racheal intensely, and he married her and then was allowed to serve the other 7 years to complete the agreement made with Laban. And he was allowed to do that after the wedding. But be that as it may, the point of these verses, particularly verse 31, is that the Lord looks upon this situation and saw that Leah was indeed loved less, and therefore he took pity on her and he allowed her to become pregnant to comfort her. It says, but Racheal is seen to remain childless. So we are then told that Leah gives birth to Reuben, and she names him Reuben, which the Hebrew word that we translate as Reuben literally means behold a son. So Leah is naming her son according to her experience of what God has done in her life. Now you might also note that it says the Lord did these things. Now it doesn't use the generic term God, but here in these verses it used the personal title of God, Lord, the same name that is the covenant name of God used in the original language of the Old Testament. So this indicates an intimate, close personal relationship between Leah and God himself. So here we have a lady who feels somewhat overlooked and unloved by her husband, and apparently she's out crying and upset, and the Lord looks upon her, takes pity on her, and she is able to conceive and have a son, Reuben. Now that's the last line of verse 32. And it's very instructive, because then she says, having these things happen, she says, maybe now my husband will love me. So clearly, Leah is still feeling unloved, isn't she? Or at least feeling not as loved as much as her sister. The text then continues in verse 34. Excuse me. where it says, she conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too. So she named him Simeon. So notice she says, because the Lord heard, she named her son the Lord heard. So once again, she's giving credit to the Lord for what she has experienced and the events in her life. Again she conceived, and she gave birth to a son and said, now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. So she named him Levi. Now, as you can guess, as this point, the Hebrew word Levi simply means attachment, to be attached. So it appears she's thinking at this point, now, well, the Lord's given me 3 sons. Surely I will now have a close attached relationship to my husband. And that's why she names him accordingly. And then Leah's situation is finished off in verse 35 when it tells us she conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, this time I will praise the Lord. So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. So last child's arrived, and she calls him Judah. And the word Judah means praise. So she named him because she wanted to praise the Lord and identify that she gave thanks to the Lord for the fact that she now had 4, count them, 4 sons. Now, this I'm calling, in a sense, it's a bit like round 1. There's been the situation between the sisters, and we've reached this little end point in the story. And as we shall see as we get into the passage, there is still a bit of an underlying conflict going on between the sisters, both of whom, of course, who are married to Jacob. In round 1, Leah felt unloved, yet she takes her case to the Lord, and the Lord gives her 4 sons, which would make a man very happy with his wife in those days. And notice also her careful choice of and the meanings of the names that she chooses of these children reflect her acknowledgement of God's providence in this situation and of God's blessing through this situation. So on one hand, God is seen to be blessing her, but he's doing it because she feels unloved. But on the other hand, there's probably a little bit of sadness there as she's still longing for for a deeper love of her husband. One commentary I read said Leah seems to have been a godly woman who spent much time in prayer concerning her marriage and her children. She acknowledged that her sons were given by the Lord in response to her prayers and to compensate for her difficult position at home. So round 1 is completed. Leah is unloved or feels unloved, but the Lord, because of her trust in him, chooses to bless her with 4 sons. Round 2 will begin in chapter 30. So let's pick that up at verse 1 of chapter 30, where we're told this. When Racheal saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, give me children or I'll die. This is the beginning of the record of the conflict between these 2 sisters, and the fact that Racheal doesn't have children. We can see the beginning of her starting to get jealous of her sister Leah, who now has 4. But notice what it says in the text. She says to Jacob, give me children or I'll die. So in a sense, I think she's blaming him for the situation and the circumstance. What can he do in response to that? I mean, clearly he's done all he can as a husband. He's been with his wife, one can assume, regularly. And with Leah having children, it doesn't appear any lack of children on Racheal's account are down to his part, yet she seems to be blaming him. Now, this is the oldest psychological trick in the book. It's called blame shifting. And we've seen it right from the very beginning of Genesis. Do you remember Adam and Eve when he ate from the tree and the Lord comes to Adam and says, what have you done? And he immediately shifts the blame and says, the woman made me do it. And then he shifts the blame not just onto the woman, but onto God himself when he says, the woman you gave me persuaded me to do this. So blame shifting is absolutely the oldest psychological trick in the book. It's here at the dawn of the human race as described in Genesis, and it's here again with Racheal using it against Jacob. And his response is seen in the next verse. Jacob became angry with her, it says, and am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children? Now that's an interesting idea and response. Back in chapter 29, at the tail end of chapter 9, we were told that it says he loved Racheal more than Leah. So he is deeply in love with this woman. Right from the moment of their first meeting, there was an intention, attraction between them. It was, you might describe it as love at first sight, so to speak. Yet he gets angry with her here, and that's interesting. So the question is, can you love someone and be angry with them at the same time? Well, I believe that you can. It doesn't mean that you should be aggressive or unpleasant, but you can have a righteous anger against a person or a situation. As a matter of fact, we see the Lord himself repeatedly angry with the children of Israel, which is obvious if you read the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. But Jacob here is so angry with her, he says, am I in the place of God? What are you talking about, he's saying. This is not my fault. I don't have the power to do anything about this. So let's look at her response. Then she says, here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that you can bear children from me, and I too can build a family through her. Wow, we've been down this route before and it didn't work out very well, did it? So Racheal, who doesn't feel she can get pregnant, so she says, here, take my maid, get her pregnant, and she'll put a child in my lap and on my breast, so to speak. And it all starts to play out from here. So look, so she gave him her servant Bilhah as wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Racheal said, God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son. And because of this, she named him Dan. So at this point, Jacob has another wife. And Racheal will actually eventually also have a child. And when she finally gets pregnant, she says, God has judged my case and has heard my voice. It has now given me a son. And that's why, therefore, she calls his name Dan. And the word Dan means to judge. So the idea is God has decided. The idea here is to help her. He's given her a son, and she's called that son Dan to commemorate the fact that the Lord decided how this should all work out. But there's more. Let's pick it up in verse 7. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Racheal said, I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won. So she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, what good fortune! So she named him Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, how happy I am! The woman will call me happy. So she named him Asher. Now, you need to note and go back to verse 1 when it said Racheal was envious of her sister. And now it says in verse 8 that she is wrestling with her sister, battling with her sister. And at this point in the chapter, that's really, if we stop here, that's one of the main points you'll pick up in the text up to this point. But there's a lot more going on in this story than just an account of a sibling rivalry or a jealousy or an envy between two sisters. There is, in fact, a constant tension that has spilt over into conflict, and they're now almost on the edge of openly battling with each other. And we've seen round 1, haven't we? Well, we'll have a look at round 2 in the next episode. Okay, we're picking up where we left off yesterday. We're doing a couple of studies just in covering the text in Genesis 20, chapter 29, verse 30, through to midway through, roughly, Genesis chapter 30, verse 24. And it's the story of Racheal and Leah. And I've called it a tale of two women. And we've identified this ongoing conflict, this ongoing sibling rivalry between these two sisters. And I identified the first part of this conflict in two rounds, as it were. Round one, we identified it was a constant tension that existed between the two sisters, these two initial wives of Jacob, but that tension is seeming to grow and morph into really what is almost becoming an out-and-out conflict. But that was round one. In round two, it begins to play out in the real world, in the real circumstances of their marriage. And Racheal gets to the point, she says, well, if I can't have children, I'm going to let my husband Jacob use my maid, as there'll be a source for having children. Because Leah, of course, has had children at this point. By the way, it's worth noting that Sarah did something similar when she gave her maid to Abraham a couple of generations back so that she could give birth to a son. And of course, that led to all sorts of problems after the arrival of Ishmael. So there is nothing new going on here, friends. But what we need to know at this point is that Leah has had 4 children and Racheal has had 2 children by her maid. And that's where we're jumping back in again. And the plot is going to thicken, as they say. And we've come to round 3, if you like. And verse 9 of chapter 30 tells us this. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "What good fortune!" So she named him Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "How happy I am! The woman shall call me happy." So she named him Asher. So now Leah's not having any more children herself, but Racheal is having them by her maid. And Leah thinks, oh, I'm going to be outdone here. So she also takes her maid and gives her to Jacob as another wife. So Jacob now has 4 wives, and the children that follow on from here are all being named in ways that represent what God is doing in each situation. So round 3 is Leah giving her maid to Jacob, and he has 2 more sons through that maid. Now let's pause for a second and try and keep up with the maths of what's going on here. Round 1, Leah has 4 sons. Round 2, Racheal by her maid has 2 sons. Round 3, Leah has 2 more sons through her maid, so she's in the ascendancy again. Now, I want to make an observation at this point, because this is an interesting story in the fact that both of these women are using their maids to have children. But that's not the end point of the story. Let's pick up in the 4th and what, in terms of this battle of producing children, will be the final round. And we'll pick it up in verse 14, which tells us, during wheat harvest, Reuben went out into the field and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Racheal said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take away my mandrakes too?" "Very well," Racheal said, "he can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." Now, do you ever read one of these ancient Old Testament texts and think, this sounds like it comes from a whole other world, a whole other place, a real sense of a different ancient place? What in the world is going on in this passage? This raises all sorts of questions in our minds. I'm sure you're wondering, what is a mandrake and why is it so important? And the answer to the first question actually, in a sense, answers the second question at the same time. Mandrake was a common plant at the time. It comes from the family of what we today call nightshade, and it had 5 long fleshy fingers with leaves, which made them look a little bit like hands. But the key point here is, for a long time, many thousands of years, up to this point, they have been seen to have medicinal and mystical properties associated with that plant. From ancient times, the root in that area was promoted for use as an aphrodisiac and also for fertility. And the idea here apparently is that Racheal says, if I could get some of that plant and I could conceive, because up to now she's not able to have any children except by her maid. So in a sense, she's making a deal with Leah to allowing her to sleep with Jacob again, provided she gives over her mandrakes that has been gathered to her by her son, originally for her, Leah. This is strange, isn't it? But let's continue, because I wonder what God's perspective in this will be. So verse 16 tells us, "So when Jacob came in from the field that evening, Leah went out to meet him. 'You must sleep with me,' she said. 'I have hired you with my son's mandrakes.' So he slept with her that night. God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, 'God has rewarded me for giving you my servant to my husband.' So she named him Issachar." Now, Issachar is an interesting name. It actually means recompense. It means payment of wages. In other words, in her mind, she's hired Jacob, her husband, for the night, and she's paid using the mandrakes, and she names her sons accordingly. That's her perspective on what has happened. I wonder if it's what's God's perspective. I'm telling you, reading these Bible stories, who needs soap operas? So let's pick up at chapters 30, verse 19. And it tells us, "Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, 'God has presented me with a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with great honor because I have borne him 6 sons.'" But of course that includes sons by the maid. So she names him Zebulon. Sometimes later she gives birth to a daughter and names her Dinah. Then God remembered Racheal. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. "God has taken away my disgrace," she said. So she names him Jacob and said, "May the Lord give me another son." Again, naming the children according to the experience. And at last, Racheal herself has a son in her own right. Now the conflict here is coming to a climax, and Racheal is seen to be driven to prayer and seeking her maid and her sister in the knowledge that... So the conflict is coming to a climax in the background that Racheal has been driven to prayer by seeing her maid and her sister having more sons than her. So that's the end of round 4. Leah has sons. She's called one Zebulun, which means exalted. She called the other Joseph, which means Jehovah has planted. All right, Leah and Racheal have both now had sons. And she calls one Zebulun, which means exalted, and she calls the other Joseph, which means Jehovah has planted. By the way, by saying Jehovah has planted this child, this, most Bible experts agree, indicates that the mandrakes had nothing to do with what's going on here. The text is making that very clear. It wasn't the mandrakes that caused pregnancy, it was the Lord. So round 1, Leah has 4 children. Round 2, Racheal has 2 more children by her maid. Round 3, Leah has 2 more children by her maid. And round 4, Leah has 3 and Racheal has another. So in total, there are 12 children now to these 4 wives. But before we finish, let's make some observations. Let me point out something that this passage reveals. Firstly, I believe it deals very clearly with the problem of bigamy, which, by the way, will soon be forbidden. In the Mosaic law, in Leviticus chapter 8, that will come along soon and make it clear that bigamy is not the way to go. One Bible expert I read said, well, one object of this narrative is without doubt to portray the evils of bigamy. Another commentator said, love this phrase, "The house of the bigamist is always divided against itself, and the fruitful source of mischief and a disruption of all true godly discipline." He points out, by the way, that these 2 wives were sisters, and because of the sibling rivalry and the jealousy caused here by having these 2 wives these 2 sisters as wives, Jacob's whole future household would come under this strife and this envy and this friction with each other. Bigamy, having more than one wife, is seen not to work in the Bible accounts. A more modern example of this is that of Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, who in 1910 met a lady patient who would become a lifelong intimate and a colleague of his. Now, it's interesting he called her Tony. Many think that was a way of disguising the fact that this new colleague and close collaborator and supporter was in fact a woman. Now, it reached a point when Irma, his wife, insisted that he give up this extramarital affair with her, but Jung insisted that she was far too important for him and he couldn't carry on without her. Now, according to Jung's biographer, he treated his mistress just exactly as a second wife, and they had a discreet triangular relationship that lasted for years and years and years. In fact, the remainder of his entire life, in spite of his wife's continual objections. The three of them would often appear in public, but the private tension between the women became more and more obvious. And the biographer of Jung said, and I quote, "It intensified to such a degree that both found it difficult to keep it under control in public. They both became increasingly openly sarcastic and hostile to each other." There you go. That's a perfect illustration of what happened here way back in Genesis chapter 30. Okay, so let's sum this passage up and what it means. In terms of narrative, it's fairly straightforward. Jacob has two wives who are jealous of each other, which leads him to end up having 4 wives, through which he bears 12 children. And that's the sum of the facts of what's going on in this chapter. But let me make a couple of observations and draw perhaps a couple of conclusions out of it. First, the chapter contains a contrast, and it illustrates the conflict between these two women. Leah was apparently a woman of faith who longed for the affection of her husband. Racheal also had faith, but it did not appear to be as strong as Leah's, but she also had an affection for her husband, but also struggled and anxiously desired the blessing of God in childbirth. In other words, the anxiety and the jealousy of these two women was the underpinning thing which led to conflict. Now, we could stop and wonder for a while, because this could cause us to remember that, and to take serious note, that this should warn us that believers should avoid envy and strife in all relationships, because it will always grow into conflict, which is not a healthy thing. Whatever your lot in life, whatever you feel, even if you feel ignored, oppressed, challenged, troubled or anxious, your attitude should not be one that changes into jealousy of someone else. Nor should our efforts result in any form of bitter rivalry. Rather, what we should do is cultivate always a wholehearted trust in the Lord, waiting patiently for his blessing upon us. One of the major themes in this passage is clearly the conflict between these two women. But as I suggested at the beginning of the passage, it not only teaches us something about that, it also teaches us something about the history of Israel and of the Lord. So there's more than just an interpersonal conflict going on here between two women, two wives as it were. This passage records God's continual faithfulness in providing Jacob with his descendants, just as he promised him back in Bethel. It centers on the Lord's fulfillment of that promise and the process that brings it about, by showing that the Lord is still able to bless Jacob through these circumstances. In other words, in spite of the envy, the jealousy, the suspicion of these two wives, the Lord allows these women and the others to have the children that are needed, that will eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. In other words, Jacob becomes the father of Israel, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, as prophesied through this increasingly messed up situation. This passage is clearly telling us something about the Lord and how he is faithful to fulfill his promises, and he still gives Jacob those multiple sons, from whom will come the multiple tribes of the great nation of Israel, through whom the whole world will be blessed. But as we are going to dig further into the Old Testament from here on and into what happens, we'll discover that the 12 here, the 12 sons mentioned here, are not going to be exactly as constituted the 12 tribes of Israel. These tribes, this nation will be divided into 12 tribes based on 12 sons, that's true, but not exactly as they've been constituted here, because we'll learn later as we progress through the book of Genesis that Reuben will, as a result of sin, God will take 2 of the sons of Joseph and use them to replace the tribes of Reuben within this story. But I also said it not only tells us something about God and something about the nation of Israel, I believe this passage can really teach us something about ourselves. There's something taught here that in the light of all the sort of the drama of the narrative of the story sometimes gets slightly passed over, I would say, but it's very important because it tells us that God looked upon Leah, who felt unloved, and he blessed her, and he specifically blessed her because she felt unloved and she cried out in prayer to him. God will later also look upon Racheal and will also identify that she feels unloved because she was childless. So both these women are identified as feeling unloved, but both within the narrative of the story are seen to reach out to the Lord and to pray earnestly, and then the Lord blesses them accordingly. God blessed them because of their need and their prayers and their willingness in the end to turn and trust in him. And what this tells me is God, characteristically, God by nature works for people through things, but particularly works when people are feeling downcast. God's desire is always to show favour to the afflicted, to support the troubled and the oppressed and the rejected. Those people, any of us who find ourselves in such predicaments, if we show faith, this tells me we can still truly rely on God. We can trust in his sovereign plan and that he will come through for us, and that in the fullness of time he will bless us if we reach out to him in truth and in trust and in prayer. His blessing will never be gained by bargaining or striving. It's gained primarily by trusting in him through prayer. And I want to close that if today you're feeling rejected, if today you're feeling downcast, if today you're feeling afflicted, then friends, just call on the Lord. Turn to him in prayer. Reach out to him and call upon him. Trust him for his blessing. Because God, the nature of God, the God that I see here in these Old Testament story, is the type of God who likes to look after the very people who feel that way.